I am excited for you guys to get to experience Amy. I first saw Amy at Keynote. She was a session at a conference I went to. You were at Seattle ABAI Autism. And my colleagues and I, we were at the event, and we were like, who is she? And how in the world can we get her? And so this is 2 years later, and we have her, and we are so grateful for the information that she is going to share. I believe that you are going to enjoy and laugh with her at some of the information that she's sharing. You are going to walk away with new knowledge, and just be forever grateful for the information that she's going to share. So I welcome you to our keynote speaker, Amy Gravino.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, glad to hear from all of you. I hope everybody's feeling good after lunch, and I know it's the last talk of the day, so thank you for hanging in. I appreciate it. I'm very glad to be here. I have to take off as soon as I finish and go back to Chicago to fly back to New York. So I hope this will be a good, memorable way to conclude today's conference. Okay. So if you scan this code with your phones, this will take you to an app I use called Slido, which will allow you to ask questions anonymously. So if there's something you're not comfortable asking, you can use the app to do this, and I will be monitoring the questions on my phone that I have here, and we'll make sure to get to them at the end. I mean, you can also ask questions the traditional way, raising your hand, but this way, if there's something you're not comfortable asking, you can do it right on your phone. So I'll give everybody just a minute to scan the QR code. Okay, looks like a few more people. Well, good. Everybody got it? Okay. So just kind of an overview of some of the topics that I'll be going over in today's keynote. I'm going to give you kind of an introduction to autism and sexuality. Some of you might be thinking, why is this an important topic? Why do we need to talk about this? Maybe you work with clients or students who are younger, who are not yet perhaps going through puberty, but they're going to go through puberty. And that's why this is important, because every autistic child that you support or love or work with is going to become an autistic adult. Big surprise. I guess not a lot of people realize that's what happens, but indeed that is what will happen. So this is information that everyone needs to know. And we'll talk about what some of the misconceptions and the myths are around autism and relationships and sexuality, and why those have often prevented conversations from happening. And ultimately, we'll also talk about what some of the consequences can be if we don't talk about autism and sexuality. Then I'll be sharing with you the first-hand perspective of a woman on the spectrum, that's me, and what my experiences were like when it came to relationships and navigating puberty and dating and sex and all that stuff. So you might have kind of a better idea of what some of your clients and students are going through at this particular moment. And then we'll talk about what my recent work that I did at Rutgers University, where I work in New Jersey, which was to develop a sex ed curriculum for autistic people. I'll talk about the process that was involved with that, how that went, and what directions I hope to take it in the future. And then, of course, I'll have some strategies, both for parents and professionals, working with autistic individuals, how you can open up a discussion and a dialogue about sexuality. I'll also share some resources that you can take home with you, and hopefully that will be useful for you. Sidebar, I hope you could see me over this podium. This is not built for short people, really, but I'm glad I wore my heels today. I feel like I need a booster seat or something, but I'm glad I can see all of you. And then, of course, we'll have time for questions at the end. So hold on to those questions, like I said, and feel free to use the Slido app as well. So I love getting to do this presentation in person because I can actually see people raise their hands. So who do you talk to about sex and dating? Do you talk to your family? Maybe not. You know, some people might be close to a sibling or someone, but most people probably wouldn't talk to their parents about sex and dating. Right? Do you talk to a therapist? I'm from New Jersey. Everyone has a therapist. It's okay. No shame. That's totally fine to talk to a therapist or a counselor about sex and dating. What about a religious leader, a priest, a rabbi? Sidebar, I don't think there's a lot of Jewish people down here because you have a grocery store called Schnucks. And in Yiddish, a schnook is like an idiot or So I saw that and I said, there are no Jewish people here at all, are there? I'm just saying, what a name for a grocery store. But probably most people wouldn't talk to a religious leader about sex and dating, maybe premarital counseling if you're into that kind of thing. What about friends? Now, this is where I should see everybody's hands go up. Probably most people, you can raise your hand, it's okay. Most people probably talk to their friends about sex and dating, right? That's the support network that most of us have. That's the kind of people we use as a sounding board for these topics. Or do you not have anyone to talk to or don't feel comfortable talking about sex and dating? That's okay too. That's totally valid if you don't feel comfortable talking about it. But a few years ago, I gave this presentation to a group of college students on the spectrum, and the majority of them, almost all of them, raised their hand for the last one. And that's where many autistic people find ourselves. We find ourselves not having anyone to talk to about this huge area of life, right? Imagine, sex and relationships are such a big part of what it means to be alive and be a human being. Imagine not having anyone to talk to about it because your sexuality is so stigmatized and seen as something so taboo just because you're disabled, or because you're autistic, whatever it might be. That's where many of us are right now. And consequently, autistic people are not getting access to comprehensive and accurate sex education in the way our neurotypical peers are. We're not having our questions answered, having things addressed that we need to know about. And as a result, we're put at much greater risk of serious consequences such as abuse, which we'll go into more in a few minutes. So just imagine, not having anyone to talk to about this. And that's where so many of us find ourselves. And it's a problem. But again, as I said, there's a lot of misconceptions and myths that add to why it's so difficult to talk about this. And some of these come from popular culture, from the media, and some come even from the diagnostic criteria we use to diagnose autism. One myth, the very first one, probably the biggest one, is that autistic people are asexual or don't have sex, right? Where does this come from? Well, part of it, again, like I said, the media shows like the Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper, which I'm glad is off the air. That adds to that. But then it's also something that we would call infantilization. And for those not familiar, infantilization means that we talk about adults with disabilities as if they're children in big bodies. So someone might say, he's 20 years old with the mentality of a 5-year-old. Well, no, he's 20 years old with the mentality of a 20-year-old. He just has his particular strengths, challenges, needs, desires, and so on. And interestingly, this is kind of the opposite of the stereotype you find in other disabled populations. Oftentimes, for example, people with Down syndrome are characterized as being hypersexual. You can't put two people with Downs in the same room together, they'll have crazy, freaky sex. And then it's the opposite with autism. And while there certainly are people who identify as asexual, and that's completely valid and fine, when it becomes the dominant stereotype of a group of people, then it's a problem. So autistic people do have sex. We have good sex, bad sex, mediocre sex, everything between. We just might need a little more help in achieving whatever goals we have that are in this area. Another misconception that often floats around is that dating an autistic guy is exactly the same as dating an autistic girl. And I was intrigued to see on one of the slides circulating throughout the day that it mentioned that 4 times as many boys than girls are autistic. Well, in actuality, I think it's that 4 times as many males are diagnosed autistic. It doesn't mean that there actually are 4 times as many, but women and girls often go underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. But again, the diagnostic criteria were developed observing boys, right? So that is one presentation of autism. But very often, autistic women don't necessarily match that presentation. And so we keep getting missed. But because, there's just this thing about that all autistic people must be the same, painting everybody with a broad brush, that's what people assume. And it should go without saying, but autistic girls and women are not the same as autistic boys, right? We have our own needs and challenges and things that need to be addressed. Again, it falls in, I've been in so many situations where parents especially will say, oh, you're autistic and my son is autistic, you could be his girlfriend. And I'm like, oh, no, like that's not what I'm here for, Or people think if you put 2 autistic people in a room, they'll be best friends. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm autistic and he's autistic, but he's an asshole. I don't want to be friends with him. Why are we assuming that, we're going to be bosom buddies? What's the, we don't do that with neurotypical people. We don't think, oh, you're neurotypical and you're neurotypical, so you'll be, the best of friends, right? That's not how that works. But again, it's important we recognize those differences because they affect everything about how the world sees us and how we interact with the world. Another misconception, individuals with autism are all straight, right? So oftentimes when sexuality is addressed, it's from a heteronormative perspective, but we have to always bear in mind that there are actually more people on the autism spectrum who identify as LGBTQ than in the neurotypical population. And this could be for any number of reasons. It could be less adherence to social norms, more honesty in reporting. But when we're talking about this, we're talking about the idea of intersectionality and that people have multiple identities that converge and affect how somebody interacts with the world. So someone might be autistic and a woman and a lesbian. Someone might be autistic and a man and gay. Someone might be autistic and trans, and all those things, or might be autistic and a person of color and gay, and all those things are affecting how that person interacts with the world. And they're things that they're going to need support with. So somebody's already trying to find acceptance just being autistic, but then all those other pieces of their identity are impacting that as well. And so, the basic takeaway is that, any sexuality or gender identity that you'll see among the neurotypical population, you'll see with people on the spectrum. So we have to be mindful of that when we are having these conversations about sexuality. Another myth, autistic people only date other autistic people. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the show Love on the Spectrum, if you've had the opportunity to see that. It was originally in Australia, and then it came over to Netflix here. I was actually in contact with the producers on the show to be the coach on the show, and then that fell through because Hollywood's gonna Hollywood. But one thing I noticed, about the Australian version, and I think the US one too, is that all the couples on the show, either couples that already came in as established couples or dates that were set up on the show, they were all autistic person and another autistic person, or autistic person and someone with another developmental disability. There were no what I call mixed neurology couples, where, an autistic person and a neurotypical person. So it's not really reflective of reality necessarily. Autistic people can and do date all different kinds of people. I know many people on the spectrum who prefer to date someone who's also autistic, who shares their diagnosis and knows what they're going through. I know people on the spectrum who date people with other mental health diagnoses, be it ADHD, OCD, bipolar disorder, and then there's people on the spectrum who date neurotypicals. For me, most autistic guys drive me up the wall, and most guys in general drive me up the wall, so what's the difference? But long story short, yes, we can date all different kinds of people. You can't control who you fall in love with, right? And boy, do I know that from experience, which you'll hear about in just a minute. Another myth, and this actually came about from a conference that I was speaking at a few years ago. Someone asked me if autistic people feel rejection the same way that neurotypicals do. And I was sort of taken aback. But again, this goes back to kind of the diagnostic criteria, right? This idea of a lack of empathy that autistic people feel. For my money's worth, they're all different levels of empathy, but I often have found that it's actually, rather than not feeling anything, it's feeling everything and not being able to filter it out. So many autistic people shut down as a result of not being able to filter those emotions. But people think that if you don't display emotions in a way that's typically expected, that you don't feel those emotions. And that's not true. I have a lifetime's worth of experience with rejection, and it always hurts. It doesn't hurt any less because I'm autistic. In fact, I think it might hurt more because I'm autistic, because I feel everything so deeply. And the last myth ties in with this, probably the most painful one, which is that individuals with autism can't love. Again, this idea that if an emotion isn't displayed in a way that people expect, that it means that someone doesn't feel it. But love doesn't have any one shape or form. Love doesn't look a certain way. And we as people on the spectrum are full of love. We have so much love to give. And in fact, the problem is finding someone who will respect and honor that love and treat us the way we deserve to be treated. That is often the problem. So with that in mind, sex is everywhere, right? We live in a very sex-saturated society. It's in our media. It's on our billboards. Interestingly, we use its presence to sell things, and we use its absence to control people in a way, right? Sex, there's all kinds of dialogues around sex that are not necessarily the healthiest. And in spite of it being everywhere, we're not comfortable having just real, honest, serious conversations about it. And this becomes even more the case, even more true when the conversation involves autistic people, right? So we're going to keep calm and talk about sex, right? We're going to get past what I call the blushing cheek phase, because if you're uncomfortable talking about sex, then your child or your clients, your students are going to feel uncomfortable talking about sex. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the secret language of emojis. I'm going to show you a very brief little clip, and then we're going to talk about the secret language of emojis. So let's see.
There's a whole kind of language.
Yes, there is.
Usually based around foodstuffs. Where they represent other things.
Yes.
And asking someone out for a taco could easily be misinterpreted, it turns out. Did you know that? Be careful. Did you know about this? Did you know about this?
Yes, of course. Where have you been?
I mean, the eggplant kind of looks like, it doesn't even look like an eggplant. It's you know.
And then you've got the peach.
And the peach.
And then
Yeah.
if you start adding to that the raindrops and all, you
Yeah.
can do anything.
It's
Don't act innocent. Don't come here with your, oh, you won't know what's
a
going on.
minefield, clearly.
But do you text? Do you have a smartphone?
I do, yes.
Okay, then I've no idea how that passed you by. That's weird.
Because I thought the emojis were just meant to represent what they represented. I didn't know there was this whole kind of other language you had to learn.
Can you get explicit emojis?
That's what we need. Yes, Apple needs to move forward and just call a vagina a vagina.
So for you Doctor Who fans, that's David Tennant up there, and what he's talking about is that, I'm more of a Good Omens fan though, by the way, just FYI, but he's talking about that the emojis that we use on our phones, they have multiple meanings to them, right? So a lot of them revolve around food, but not all do. But so, for example, the eggplant is a penis, the peach is a butt, the raindrops use your imagination, and so if you're not aware of this kind of subtextual language, you're going to be missing out on a huge piece of the conversation, right? So when we talk about sex in our society, we often talk about it in a kind of code, right? So how many words are there for arm, right? An arm is an arm. But how many slang words are there for penis? There's a million slang words for penis. How many slang terms are there for sexual intercourse? There's a zillion. And so if you're someone who already struggles, with communication and especially subtext and nonverbal communication, it's going to be very difficult for you to know what peers are talking about. It's going to set you up to be in a very vulnerable position. So for people on the spectrum, talking about sex is like learning a whole other language. And so again, if you don't know that emoji language, you're missing out on a huge piece of what's happening. And it's the same thing with just navigating this entire area of sexuality. So why is it so important? Well, we've seen a couple of reasons why. Again, because sexuality is not assumed to be part of the human experience for people on the spectrum. I'm thinking of an anecdote from Dr. Isabelle Hanout, who's a sexologist out of Montreal in Quebec. And she talks about working with a young man who was in a relationship, and he was experiencing erectile issues. He was on the spectrum, and he was trying so hard to maintain an erection that he was causing physical harm to himself. And she went to his doctor. It turned out it was a side effect of a medication that he was on. And she said to the doctor, "Why didn't you tell him that this was a side effect of the medication?" The doctor said, "Well, he's not going to have sex. He's autistic." So this assumption on the part of this rather arrogant or ignorant or both doctor resulted in physical harm to this young man. And all too often when I've been at conferences in the past, it's always the big three areas that are covered, which is usually housing, employment, and recreation, and relationships just always get left out. So it's just still not something that people think autistic people need to know about, and we'll go more into that in a little while. But the other reason that this is so important is because, as somebody much wiser than me once said, sex begins long before sex begins. Well, what does that mean? It means that when people hear the word sex education, they freak out. They think, you want to teach autistic people how to have sex. No, we're teaching people how to live life. That's what this is. Intimacy is what we're really talking about. Intimacy is something you create with someone long before you're ever thinking of getting in between the sheets with them. Intimacy can be emotional, it can be intellectual, it can be physical without being sexual, right? Intimacy is so many different things. And it's something you build when you're trying to establish a friendship with someone, first and foremost. So sex isn't just about sex, is what we're really getting at here. It's also important because, as we just saw, communication is key, right? And if you're someone who struggles with communication or whose communication style, let's say, is not always understood by neurotypicals and those around you, it's going to be difficult, that much more difficult, to establish and maintain interpersonal relationships. And ultimately, the reason why this is so important is because the consequences of not providing accurate and comprehensive sex ed are much too great. And of course, one of those consequences, and I shouldn't have to say it, but is abuse. And sexual abuse occurs at higher rates among autistic people than non-disabled and autistic people, but it's reported far less frequently. Well, again, thinking about the stigma, right? We've had a Me Too movement in the neurotypical world. We haven't yet had a Me Too movement in the autism world. And I think that we need one, right? But imagine, you're already a woman and people don't necessarily consider you, there's already that stigma against reporting sexual abuse, although certainly men can be victims of sexual abuse as well, by no doubts. But then when you're autistic, people think that you're an unreliable narrator. Oh, he doesn't understand. We were just playing a game. He doesn't get it. Or, she doesn't understand. We were just having fun. And more often than not, law enforcement officers are likely to side with the perpetrators rather than the victims. That was certainly the case when I was in high school, and, the principal and everybody sided with the bullies who bullied me rather than me. And so it's certainly, unfortunately, still the case. And the other reason why abuse, I think, isn't reported very frequently is that we're not teaching autistic people what abuse looks like, right? Abuse can take many different topographies. It can be physical, it can be financial, it can be verbal, emotional, sexual. So because people don't even know they're being abused, how can they then report it, right? And also, we tend to rely far too much on the idea of stranger danger, right? For autistic people, we're far more likely to be abused by someone who knows us, someone with access and with opportunity. And so then, if the person that you trust, the person that you're supposed to be relying on is the one hurting you, then who do you tell? Then what do you do? That's the conversation we need to be having. That's what we need to be talking about. And just some statistics to kind of reinforce this. Graham Holmes et al., 6.4% of youth in their survey had a documented history of sexual abuse. Mandel et al., 16.6% of children with autism in their study had been sexually abused. And Brown-Lavoie, 78% of respondents with ASD reported at least one instance of sexual victimization. And the problem with these statistics is that I think these are actually low, right? This is only what's been reported. And again, going back to what we said about how so much abuse goes unreported, my feeling is that the actual numbers are much higher. If we had people being cognizant of what abuse actually is, these numbers, I think, would increase significantly. So again, how much is reported? How much is then prosecuted? Very, 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 very little. But how much actually occurs is much, much higher than that. And I say this not to scare you, to alarm you, but to let you know what it is we're facing and why it's so important that we open these conversations, and also much sooner than you might think. And we'll go more into that in a moment as well. So, in thinking about all this, I thought to myself, well, what better way than to educate the people about the experiences of individuals on the spectrum than with me to tell you about some of my experiences and the things that I have been through. So this is just a little bit about me and the current work that I'm doing. As was mentioned, I work at Rutgers as a relationship coach. I'm also the president of my own organization, Ascot Consulting. This says Dr. Ruth of the autism world, but I recently was called the Taylor Swift of autism, which that is the first and last time in my life anyone's ever going to compare me to Taylor Swift, I'm pretty sure. But I also was in the film version of In a Different Key, which was a New York Times bestselling book by John Donovan and Karen Zucker. It premiered on PBS in December of 2022. And I've co-authored a book chapter about sexuality and sex education with Dr. Peter Gerhardt and Dr. Jess Kauke. I am currently writing my own book, which is called The Naughty Audie, which is a memoir of my experiences with dating as a woman on the spectrum. However, back long before all of that, I was 13 years old. And, like any other 13-year-old, I was in the throes of puberty, right? I was going through it. And I was beginning to develop crushes. And these were some of the crushes that I was having at that time. You might be wondering what Davy Jones from the Monkees is doing there in the lower right corner. I discovered Monkees on Nick and Night's Summer Block Party when I was 12, and Davy was my first favorite. And of course, that did wonders for my popularity, having pictures of a band that was popular 30 years earlier taped to my locker door. That was sarcasm. I'm autistic. I can use sarcasm. It did nothing for my popularity whatsoever. But again, this is the direction I was in. I guess floppy hair was my thing at the time. I don't know what to tell you. My body didn't care that I was autistic, right? My body didn't care that I have a disability. I was going to go through puberty no matter what. And even though I had all these questions and all these curiosities and feelings at, 12, 13 years old, I didn't have my first kiss till I was 17. So that's kind of a big gap, right? And the theme that was to begin at this time and has continued through my life is the theme of disconnect. In this case, a disconnect between the things that I was curious about, questions that I had, and any learning opportunities that I might have had to explore those curiosities and questions. And that disconnect certainly felt very strongly in puberty. And I still remember feeling overwhelmingly disconnected from my body. I often liken it to a balloon barely tethered to the earth. That's how I felt, like I was just barely holding on to myself. And that's a big problem, right? When you don't have a sense of ownership over your own body. That opens the door for someone to come along and say, oh, I see you. You're not broken. You're great just the way you are. And it makes it very easy for someone to take advantage, right? And that's all I was wanting at that time, was for someone to tell me that I wasn't broken and that I was okay the way I was. But I can remember even when I had my first period and I had no idea what was happening until my mother came in the bathroom one day and said, oh, you're a woman now. And I ruined like 5 pairs of underwear that week and had no clue what was happening because I wasn't interested in my body. And I don't mean disinterested, like in like the disaffected teenager kind of way. I mean that my self-esteem was so non-existent that I didn't care about myself. I didn't care what was happening with my body. I didn't care if I lived or died because of the bullying I was experiencing. And I became suicidal from the age of 10, because of that. But again, I think there tend to be a lot of misunderstandings too about how puberty affects autistic individuals. We tend to think that there isn't as much of a pronounced effect as there is on neurotypicals. Going back to what we were saying about emotions not being displayed in a way that we normally expect. We don't expect a neurotypical 15-year-old to come home from school and deliver a full-on soliloquy about what their day was like. And we just know that, they'll talk about it, when they're ready. And if something, but then when an autistic, 15-year-old comes home from school, if they don't go into a full-on soliloquy about their whole day, we think, they're fine, nothing happened, everything's fine. And that's often not the case, right? I think of the show Atypical, which has, it has had an autistic main character, and we see the internal life of all the other main characters, the mother, the sister, the father, but we don't see the internal life of the young man. And neurotypicals are really bad at envisioning the internal life of autistic people, which is ironic, given that we're the ones told that we have trouble with perspective taking. Physician, heal thyself, I'm just saying. But again, because if those emotions are not displayed in a way that we expect, we think that someone doesn't feel them, and that's not necessarily so. And in fact, someone might be in complete turmoil going through puberty, as many teenagers are, right? Sometimes it's not the autism screwing us up. Sometimes it's just being a teenager. And we're not allowed that grace, right? Neurotypical teenagers are allowed to screw up. They're allowed to not know who they are. They're allowed to make mistakes. Autistic teenagers aren't. We're not allowed to make a mistake. We're not allowed to be screwed up. Everything has to be in place. Every milestone has to be sure to be hit, or we're never going to do that. And that's not. It's an enormous amount of pressure to put on someone, right? It's an enormous amount of pressure for me to go to school and barely get through school each day, and then be expected to come home and to have to continue to hold all that in when all I can do when I get home is just let everything out that I've been holding in the entire day. And so because of everything that I was experiencing in school, fighting with the school to get supports put in place, to get my IEP enforced, dealing with the bullying that I was facing, my parents and I never got to have the talk, the birds and the bees kind of talk. And I'm of the opinion personally that is best left to the movies. I think that, sex and sexuality isn't one talk, it's many talks over the lifetime, right? Or at least it should be. The things I had questions and curiosities about when I was 12 and 13 weren't the same things I had questions about when I was 17, or when I was 20, or when I was 27, and so on. So those conversations have to keep happening as time goes on. It can't just be one and done. But because of like I said, everything that was happening, we just never had that conversation. And consequently, I wound up learning about sex kind of from the worst places you could, which is from my peers and the internet. And, the internet was a little bit different then than it is now, but there were chat rooms. We didn't have Snapchat and TikTok and stuff like that, but I would go into chat rooms, Yahoo chat rooms for the Backstreet Boys. I'm dating myself horribly here. But, and that was, and I always say that I'm the first person who went online to be themselves instead of to be someone else. And I found acceptance, because it was made very clear to me that who I was in real life was not acceptable. And it was such a joy to finally begin to build friendships online. Incidentally, one of the people on there who was from Texas and I'm from New Jersey, we finally met in person in Chicago several years ago. So I thank the Midwest for giving me that moment with my friend of many, many years. But again, they say that men watch their porn and women read their porn, and I began, reading erotic fiction around the age of 14 voraciously and began writing about it because I had no outlet for my curiosities. I wasn't going out on dates. I didn't go out on a single date in high school. Boys were too busy calling me ugly every chance they had, and nobody was kissing me under the bleachers, certainly. So this was where I began to, find my outlet and discover myself. But of course, even though the internet was a little bit different, there were some things that were similar, and there are still predators, right? And one day, a man came in the chat room, and he said that he was AJ from the Backstreet Boys. And I believed him. I had no reason to think he wasn't who he said he was. And unbeknownst to me, my parents hired a private investigator, and he was some guy who lived in Michigan. I don't know who he really was, and he sent me a ring, a fake diamond ring, and a typed letter, not handwritten, and really kind of preyed on me in ways that I didn't fully understand at the time. The worst that it got was that he asked me one time to send him a picture of my breasts. And this was before digital cameras, but my parents had a flatbed scanner, if you guys remember those old scanners, right? So it was on top of our computer desk, and so I hoisted all 90 pounds of myself onto this flatbed scanner, and I scanned my boobs, and I sent them to him, and then he proceeded to send the picture to all my friends in the chat room. And at the time, I was thrilled beyond measure. I was like, oh, he just loved what he saw so much, he wanted to share it with everyone. This is where I was, 14, 15 years old, desperate for acceptance, desperate for validation, and I was completely thrilled. Right up until my one friend said, oh, Amy, those are your breasts? I thought that they were ears because they were so small. And self-esteem destroyed all over again. I can laugh about it now. It's hilarious to me now, but at the time it was a little bit devastating. But yeah, I was lucky that, it didn't go beyond that. But that's what it is to prey on someone. It's not just preying on someone's body, but on their heart and on their mind. And giving someone the thing that that they want. And that's, again, kind of been a recurring theme, which I'll share more about in a moment. But my reasons for, again, being online were because I had so many disappointing experiences in real life. And when I was 15, a boy moved in across the street from my parents, and he had the hugest freckles I'd ever seen and a bowl haircut that put Julius Caesar to shame. And so, of course, I developed a crush on him right away. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about intimacy, right? Wanting to establish emotional closeness with him, but not knowing how to do that. So I would compensate for that with physical closeness. So he'd be here on the computer. He'd say, Amy, come here. I want to show you something. And I'd come over. Oh, okay. What is it? And I'd be right on top of him in his personal bubble, steadily pissing him off more and more without realizing it. Until he finally stopped talking to me. And every time I'd see him across the street, I would wave and he would glare at me. And about 50 or 100 waves and glares later, I finally got the message. As I mentioned earlier, my first kiss wasn't until I was 17, and it was in an ice skating rink in a game of Truth or Dare, as you do. And again, I developed a big crush on this boy. And we didn't go to the same school, so I wasn't seeing him in person with any regularity, but I called his house one time and his mother answered the phone. What are you doing? How dare you call here? Don't you ever call here again? When you used to be able to slam receivers down. And no one could explain to me why this woman was so upset that a 17-year-old girl was calling her 14-year-old son. And I suppose emotionally, developmentally, I was maybe closer to where he was. You might find this with some of the students you work with, that they tend to get along better with peers who are younger than they are, or adults who are much older than they are. And that was certainly the case for me. And I never really got along with peers my own age. But no one could explain, why this was not okay. And I never saw him again after that. Though incidentally, I found out a few years ago that he came out as gay, which fits with my track record. So there you go. So then... Then senior problem comes along, right? And I was raised on a healthy diet of, teen movies, She Is All That, and all those things. And I thought, this is going to be my perfect high school moment. I see the heads nodding when I said She's All That. I feel less alone. Thank you. Thank you, millennials. I know you're with me. And so, I had a crush on this boy, and he was a junior. The only way juniors went to the senior prom was with a senior. And so I asked him, and he said yes. But he was friends with the seniors. I wasn't. And one of the most vivid memories I have is of going to one of my classmates' homes right before the prom to take pictures, parents taking all the pictures. And my classmate answered the door, and he greeted my date and didn't say a word to me. And I don't know that anybody did at the house. And then at the prom itself, We'd had the few obligatory slow dances, but he was friends with the seniors. I wasn't, so he was dancing with other girls out on the dance floor most of the night, and I was sitting at the table writing poetry on scraps of paper. So I did not get my perfect high school moment that I was hoping for. And it was just another in that long line of disappointments. However, at age 19, finally, I had my first boyfriend. It's a miracle. It was all I ever wanted. I still call him my starter boyfriend because I had no idea what I was doing. And he was a year older than I was and therefore more experienced. And so I felt that I had to defer to him. And that was the role I found myself in. And I found myself trying to play the part of a girlfriend. Not that I wasn't being myself, but for my behavior analyst people, I kind of made a task analysis out of being a girlfriend. Like, well, I have to laugh at his jokes, even if they're not funny. I have to go where he wants to go. I have to be nice to his parents. Like trying to make rational sense of something that's not inherently rational. But again, that disconnect reared its head between kind of what was expected of me in a relationship versus what I was able to do. Just, not really knowing what it was to be in a relationship and how to keep a relationship going. And it didn't help that, my boyfriend would continuously say that, he was going to dump me for a real woman, meaning one with hips and breasts, neither of which I particularly had at that moment. And in actuality, he did end up dumping me twice. He dumped me, we got back together, and then he dumped me again. And I'm a very loyal person when it comes to friendships. It's very hard for me to let go of friendships. Maybe that's the autism, maybe it's Amy, maybe it's Maybelline, I don't know. It's all of the above. But I convinced myself we had to stay friends, even though he turned into an emotionally abusive jerk. And I remember one night we were on the front stoop of the dorm building where we both lived. So he lived on the first floor with a mutual friend. They were roommates. I lived on the third floor in a solo room. We're out on the front stoop, and the mutual friend is smoking a cigarette, and I'm trying to talk to him. And my ex is like, "Go away, get out of here. Nobody wants you here. We don't care what you have to say." And I'm all, it's a free country. I have every right to be out here. And he proceeded to physically assault me, which sounds sort of worse than it was, but he kicked me in the shin and he slapped my forehead with the back of his hand. And he was 6'3", I'm 5 feet nothing. So it wasn't really an even match, as it were. And, we get back in the building and my friend says, "Amy, go get the RA. Tell her what happened. I'll back you up. Just go get the RA. Just go." So I wound up going to the RA. And I told the RA what happened. I went to the police and filed for protection from abuse order, which is similar to a restraining order. I had to testify in court. My friend testified on my behalf. I won the order of protection. We had an on-campus hearing with the Dean of Student Affairs. My ex-boyfriend had to move out of the dorm. No third-party contact, no email, no nothing. And I hadn't seen or heard from him since then, kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And it was until that moment the most traumatic thing I'd been through, although it was nothing compared to what was coming next. But that was, and apparently I'm incapable of having a relationship end in a non-dramatic fashion, or at least it seems that way. But when I was 22 years old, I fell in love for the first time. And when you're autistic, you're often made to feel that you need to prove you feel the things you feel because people don't believe you know what love is, or they don't believe you understand how deep these things run, and they run very, very deep. And I knew that I had loved my college boyfriend, but I wasn't in love with him. And I had opportunities in college, like I say, to have sex, but I didn't. I say the best things my ex-boyfriend ever did was introduce me to Japanese food and leave me a virgin, which he did. We did other stuff, but not that. But this guy, again, I kind of met in the worst place you could, which was online, on a message board for fans of a film director. And I was in college in Pennsylvania. He lived in Seattle. And my spring break senior year of college, I passed up the opportunity to see Spam-A-Lot with my dad on Broadway, which I will forever regret, to go to Seattle with some friends where I met this guy in person. And I fell for him even more. And I wound up moving out there after I graduated. So 3,000 miles away from all my friends and all my family. And if you leave now, you'll miss out on the best part. But it's okay. I understand. Do what you got to do. Thank you for coming. So we were sitting in his car one night, I remember, and I turned to him and I said, "Jonathan, I think I'm in love with you." And his response was, "I know." He wasn't Han Solo. You might think he was. He was not Han Solo. But, when you have rose-colored glasses on, all the flags look red, right? And it doesn't matter if you're autistic or not. Being in love makes you stupid. And so in that moment, I thought, oh, of course he knows. He knows me better than I know myself. I didn't have to tell him. Of course he knew. And so I just, fell for him even more. And I decided he was going to be the one I was going to lose my virginity to. And you often hear it said that young people think that they're invincible and nothing can happen to them. Well, I'm autistic, so everything's already happened to me. So I got on the pill before I moved out there, and I waited the full month you're supposed to wait for the pill to kick in before we had sex. And I made sure that we had condoms, and I asked him to wear a white button-down shirt because I always wanted to unbutton a guy's shirt when we were going to make love. And I told you, I'm a writer. These things just, come to me. And I had the bottle of wine picked out. I had the music burned on the CD. And this is before MP3 players, of course. So I thought that I was super, super prepared and ready. But I was still in that place of low self-confidence, low self-esteem, right? Thinking, if I screw this up, he'll never want to have sex with me again. Nobody will ever want to have sex with me again. And this is before I ever even was looking at ABA, but I found a way to, not task analysis, but I'm losing the word that's coming to mind, but to get feedback on this. And I thought, well, when you eat at a restaurant, you stay at a hotel, they have these cards you can fill out to say what your experience was like. So I made a sexual intercourse comment card, which you can see here. When I told my colleague, Dr. Pierre Gerhardt, about this, he said, Amy, that's the most autistic thing I've ever heard of. And I think the world would be a better place if more people did this. And so this was, very serious, tongue slightly in cheek. And he did fill it out. He did humor me for whatever reason. He's the only one I've ever given it to. But the purpose behind this was because I wanted to have conversations that I didn't know how to have. And so these are some of the questions that were on the back. What did you enjoy most about the sex session? What do you think could have been better? What didn't happen you'd like to have happen in the future? Please rate the following from 1 to 5. The outfit I had on pre-intercourse, my facial expressions, my vocal volume. Is there anything I can do in the future to get you aroused more quickly and maximize your pleasure during our sessions? There's a problem with these questions, though. And it was a problem I didn't see at the time and didn't see until many years later with the gift of hindsight. And the problem is that these are all about his pleasure and enjoyment. There's nothing about whether I enjoyed myself. And many autistic people, we are people pleasers. We want to make others happy, whether that's parents or teachers. And certainly a lover would fall under that heading as well. And I was in love. And of course, I wanted to make the person I was in love with happy. That was all that mattered. I'm just remembering it. When I remember it, I remember everything I felt. Not just, and it's like I'm feeling it again. It's very painful and bittersweet. But so again, I didn't have that, and I forgot to mention the other thing that I did in preparation for this momentous occasion, which was that I bought a University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform because he said he had a thing for cheerleaders, and so we started off the events of the night naked, and then partway through he was having some trouble staying in the mood, if you will, and I said, "Close your eyes, I have a surprise for you." And I went to the closet and I put it on, and I lost my virginity in a University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform, which is weird, but that is what happened. So I thought, again, I had years of anticipation and writing erotic fiction. I thought that I was super, super prepared. And of course, you never are, certainly not for the emotional piece. And so what followed was kind of what you'd expect to follow, which was that about 6 months later, after we had intercourse 8 times, and I did count, he told me about a girlfriend that he'd forgotten to mention. And he was also sleeping with half the women in the city limits of Seattle. So all these other girls were calling his girlfriend to say how great he was in bed, but I was the jamoke who fell in love with him. The schnook, if you will, who fell in love with him. And so I was the easy target. And so his girlfriend proceeded to call me at all hours of the day and night, harassing me, threatened to kill me if I didn't leave town, wanted to know all kinds of details and information. And because he was so much of a coward, when I found this all out, it was online or on the phone. He never confronted me face to face. There was no face-to-face conversation. There still hasn't been one, almost 20 years later. And so he even wrote me an email saying, I think it was at her request, not that it matters, saying, your first time was the grossest thing I ever did. You were just a retarded whore that I effed. You meant nothing to me. Keep thinking that we had something. You're delusional. And I mentioned before that I had met him on a message board, and she went into his account on the message board and posted this email for everybody to read. So this private thing became an 11-page thread that everyone was commenting on, mostly to tell him what a jerk he was and how could he do this. and so on. And again, I came to learn from all this. There are two kinds of moving on, right? I didn't know that at the time. The first was that I sort of had no choice. He was ripped out of my life, and I was to never see him again. And I remember that I couldn't even look at the cheerleader uniform anymore. And I had also given him an engraved pen and a monogrammed journal, and he returned the journal and the pen to me in a box outside my building at 6 a.m., again, coward. And I took the pen and the journal and the uniform, and I went to the side of my apartment building, and I set them on fire. And it was this cathartic, spiritual moment right up until the fire trucks came because the alarms went off. And I thought I was going to get evicted or go to jail or both, but luckily I didn't. But I remember my best friend at the time said, come back to New York, just stay with me for a couple of days. And I remember sitting in the airport and, calling him one last time. And look, every time the phone would ring before that, I could still see the phone in my hand, my little Nokia flip phone with the blue screen. And I would answer it, hoping it was him saying he was picking me over her because, I was in love, like I said. And that last phone call in the airport, him saying, we're getting married, get the F out of our lives. Like, okay, good luck with that. But it was devastating. And the thing of it is that, they write songs about heartbreak, right? There are movies about it. But the only way I could learn about what it was like to have my heart broken was to have my heart broken. And that was how I knew I could survive it. And it took me about 7 years, I would say, to move on from what he did. I don't think you ever necessarily get over something like that, but you do move on. And I knew I had moved on because I developed feelings for someone new, which I didn't think would be possible. And things ended up not working out with that guy, but I was still okay afterward, which I also didn't think would be possible. And so it's funny how these things can sometimes have an epilogue, right? A few years ago, I was in New Orleans for an autism conference, and I'd learned through the grapevine that he wasn't living in Seattle anymore. He was living in New Orleans, and he was working at a bar 3 blocks away from where I was staying for the conference. And I was still chasing this idea of closure. We have this notion of what closure is. It's that big face-to-face confrontation. And I thought that I still needed that. And so against my better judgment, I walked to the bar one day, and I go in and I see somebody from behind and looks like him, and it wasn't him. And I said, is Jonathan working today? And he wasn't working that day. And in that moment, I had a rush of emotions flood over me. I felt happiness, sadness, relief, anguish, joy. And I knew with absolute perfect clarity that I had to go to that bar to know that I didn't have to go to that bar, that there was nothing that I could ever get from him. I remember, even a few months after the harassment from his girlfriend finally ended, he sent me a message online saying, sorry for ruining your life. And I'd felt a lot of things up to that point. I'd felt sadness, I felt heartbreak. But in that moment of reading that message, I felt something I hadn't, which was anger. Pure, clear, undiluted anger. And I thought, screw you, how dare you give yourself that much credit? You didn't ruin my life. I'm still here. And I'm still here all these years later. Thank you. And so outside that bar in New Orleans, I knew that he was never going to be able to give me any closure, that I had already gotten that closure from myself, that it could never come from any place else. And it was just like that validation I had chased for so many years, wanting a boy or someone to tell me that I wasn't broken and that I was fine the way I was, better than fine. That only happened when I looked in the mirror and liked the person that I saw. It had to come from me. Nobody else could give that to me. And again, it was mentioned earlier that they saw me in Seattle when I presented there. That was my first time back in Seattle in 15 years, in the 15 years since I had moved away to go to graduate school. And I actually walked to my old building, and as I was walking, I tripped on the sidewalk and scraped my knee, and I got back up, and I said, there's a metaphor here. And as I stood in front of my building, it looked exactly the same, but it wasn't the same, because I wasn't the same. I wasn't the same girl who had stood there 15 years earlier when I'd left. And I hadn't been defeated by what happened, and I hadn't been broken by it. And I had come so far. And it was just this incredible full circle moment to experience that and know that in my heart. So I just wish it hadn't come at quite such a high price, but these things often do, So in thinking about all this, thinking about the things that I went through, of course, the question that I sought to answer when I went off to graduate school and since then is, how can we help autistic people learn dating and sexuality skills? Well, sad for me that when I started grad school in 2007, there was almost nothing in the research literature about dating and sexuality. Now there is starting to be much more, which is wonderful. But a lot of what exists now is anecdotal, which means that it's talking to people about their experiences and cataloging those experiences, which is great, by the way. To all the researchers out there, I don't know where you have been. Autistic people have been here all along. I don't know why it took you so long to talk to us. But there's still not much when it comes to teaching skills. Quantitative research is still kind of missing in that vein. And oftentimes when professionals, BCBAs, OTs, whoever it might be, speech pathologists, anyone, paras are brought in to address sexual behavior, it's usually to stop something, right? Instead of to teach something. Well, Tommy is engaging in inappropriate masturbation. Tara is, rubbing up against this or that, or, it's always to stop something. And, sexuality is so much more than just behavior, which we'll go into in just a moment. But when we don't focus on teaching skills, we're missing out on a huge piece of what we need to do to help autistic people engage in sexuality appropriately and healthily and safely. So why is there such a hesitation and a reluctance to talk about sexuality and dating with autistic and disabled people? I think there's a lot of reasons for this, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think there's a lot of preconceived ideas about autism and sex, right? Again, this idea that it's not necessary. People think, well, this is not something that, my child's ever going to need to know because they're not going to be interested in sex. Ma'am, how old is your child? He's 15. Ma'am, that's all he thinks about is sex. Like, it's amazing to me. And so many parents have a hard time seeing their child as a person and not just as their child. I think that's where a lot of this stems from. But in terms of, talking about this and trying to teach these skills, this is a huge part of it, right? Just, again, also assuming that autistic people are asexual or not interested in sex, thinking that people are just children in big bodies. All these things contribute to why these conversations are so difficult to have, as well as the idea of compliance, right? Let me just grab some water. We tend to so frequently focus on compliance and making sure that autistic people are doing what we need them to do, sitting when we need them to sit, wearing what we need them to wear. We forget that non-compliance is a social skill too, and it's a safety skill, right? So if you create someone who's over-compliant, you're almost creating a perfect victim in a lot of ways, because you're creating someone who's going to defer to and go along with anyone who says they're in a position of authority. We have to teach discrimination when it comes to compliance. We can't just always because neurotypicals are not always compliant, right? But we don't punish neurotypicals for not being compliant in a lot of cases. But yet we do that for people on the spectrum. But non-compliance, and I'll go into this more in a few moments, no is a complete sentence, right? We forget that saying no is just as important as saying yes. And that's something that we have to remember and focus on and actively teach. But again, many people also don't feel like they don't know how to teach these skills. For my part, I hate the word expert because I think we're always learning so much all the time about sexuality, and we're learning so much all the time about autism that nobody's really, quote, an expert, so to speak. I prefer the word specialist for that reason. But you don't have to know all the answers to be able to teach these things. Sometimes the most powerful thing that you could say is, I don't know. I've said this to clients that I work with. I don't know the answer to that question. Let's find out together. And it's okay to, especially if you're working with an interdisciplinary team, you have other professionals that you can rely on, and their knowledge as well. And don't feel like you have to know every single answer. Sometimes, especially when it comes to sexuality and relationships, there is no right answer, right? That's just how it is. And again, I think one of the other reasons we're reluctant is the fear of consequences, right? We're teaching something that has an inherent level of risk to it, right? When we put ourselves out there, there's a chance that we might get hurt, might have our heart broken, might have something else happen. But when I talk about this, I often talk about how we as autistic people have the right to what I describe as the dignity of risk. And what that means is that we have the right to be able to take, teaching autistic people isn't just about eliminating risks at all costs. It's about teaching people how to handle risks, right? How to safely, because the world is not risk-free inherently. That's not how the world works, right? So yes, there may be consequences, but sometimes experience is the only teacher as well. Like I said before, the only way I could learn about how to deal with having my heart broken was by having my heart broken. And nobody could necessarily, spare me from that. I mean, I know for my whole life, I've always ended up learning things the hard way, but that's how it's been for me. But I have learned, certainly. But so, in thinking about all this and thinking about this, the reluctance and the challenges that come with having these conversations, I wanted to, try to actively create a curriculum for people on the spectrum. And I was able to do this through my work at Rutgers, and it's called the Adult Autism and Sexuality Kit. And the reasoning, behind this, why I decided to pursue this, as I just mentioned, that lack of quantitative research, how there's just so little out there in this area when it comes to teaching sexuality and dating skills to people on the spectrum. Again, the diagnostic criteria and the stereotypes adding to that idea that there's not a need for a sex education for people on the spectrum. And again, those biases that I mentioned, the things that add to the stigma and the taboo around autism and sexuality, as well as the fact that, when we think about sex education, I often liken it to curb cuts, right? When curb cuts were introduced, they didn't just benefit people who use wheelchairs. They benefited people with mobility challenges, people who push strollers. Everybody wound up benefiting from curb cuts. If we had comprehensive and inclusive sex education that included the life skills piece, which is really this piece that many people on the spectrum have trouble with, if we included that life skills piece, it wouldn't just benefit autistic people, it would benefit everybody. And so this is something I hope will expand beyond even what we've just done at Rutgers. But this is my fantastic team, without whom I would never have been able to complete the curriculum. Dr. Vanessa Ball, who's the director of the Psychological Services Clinic at the RCAS, and Dr. Erin Lipsack, who is at the Lifespan ASD lab there, and Genta Kukash, who is a research assistant. So the way that this kind of all began was we applied and received a $25,000 grant from Next for Autism in May of 2022. This is my first grant as a principal investigator, by the way. And I had no idea what I was doing. They don't tell you how much red tape is involved with grants, but it was certainly complex. And we began by reviewing a curriculum called ANSWER, ANSWER is the oldest sex education curriculum in the country. It's housed at Rutgers. And so there's a lot of existing material that we decided to look into and look at how we can modify that for our autistic participants. We also conducted stakeholder interviews. A lot of these, we kind of used the National Sexuality Education Standards as a basis for some of what we were conducting, looking at the 7 main content areas and asking the stakeholders to rank the areas they felt were most important for autistic people. The stakeholders were mainly autistic adults, but we also interviewed a few parents of adults on the spectrum. We interviewed a non-speaking adult on the spectrum also. And so in continuing the process of putting together the curriculum, we were modifying those existing lesson plans, as I said, the ones that were already in existence, and then creating original content. So Genta would help us create original characters around whom we modeled much of the dialogue in the curriculum, having scenarios for them, seeing what that would look like. And we decided, because this is such a massive area, it's kind of impossible to figure out where you want to focus. We decided after the stakeholder interviews and looking at what we were going to concentrate on doing to focus on healthy relationships and personal safety. Those were within the realm of preparedness for sex. So there's another curriculum out there that I'll talk about in a few moments that focuses more on healthy relationships and autistic people forming relationships. But we really wanted to focus more on sex and what it is to get ready for sex. And there's a lot that goes into that, actually. It's quite involved. Which you wouldn't think, but it actually is. And these were the content areas that we touched on within the curriculum: personal values and boundaries, intimacy, of course, as I mentioned, how the different topographies of intimacy, physical, emotional, so on and so forth. Consent, of course, consent is a huge area of discussion. What consent looks like, how to give and receive consent. Digital communication and sexting, that's obviously a big concern for many people, young people nowadays on the spectrum. Managing expectations for sex, right? Talking about the difference between porn and sex, that sex is not porn and porn is not sex. Navigating sensory issues and sex. How do you talk to a partner about sensory issues that many people on the spectrum experience? And of course, anatomy, physiology, and the sexual response cycle, which we kind of drew from Masters and Johnson's work in the 1960s. And all of this was through the lens of autistic communication. So what made this so distinct, I think, from other curricula that presently exist is that we didn't want to just tell people, this is the neurotypical way of doing things, this is how you should do it. No, we wanted to tell people, this is what neurotypicals may expect, but this is, let's find the way that works best for you to achieve the goal that you have with your autistic communication style. We're not saying you have to change and be something that you're not. Let's find the way to use your communication style to achieve the goals that you have. And also what set us apart is that once we created the content, we sent it off to an autistic consultant who was a trans individual named Dylan, who gave us some incredible feedback about what we had modified, what we had come up with, and which helped us to further modify the material before we began to run the groups. So we ran the groups in January of this year. I'm happy to say it took us quite a while to get through all of this, and the thing about writing a curriculum is that I had no idea how to do that either. This is the first curriculum I've ever written. And I had a nervous breakdown a few times because every time I thought I knew what we were doing, suddenly it would change. And it was like starting all over again. Don't do grants. If anybody out there, grants are a pain. Don't even bother. No, I mean, if you could do it. But I mean, just make sure you have a good team helping out, because that's what made all the difference for me, certainly. And so the groups, instead of, we were originally looking at an 8-week program, but because of time constraints within the grant, we had 2 groups that were 4 hours each. And the groups wound up being run virtually. Again, we were going to run them in person, but the weather decided to be funny like it was here today, and it snowed, and so we wound up running the groups virtually instead of in person, which actually worked out because it let us know that we could run this with other people in other parts of the country or the world. It makes it more accessible to more autistic people and disabled people as well. And the groups were co-facilitated by me and Erin, who you saw previously, with Vanessa and Genta as what we call flight attendants. So we were kind of the pilots, and they were there for any logistical issues, anything that anybody needed assistance with outside of just running the content. And so, we had, we had, I think, 7 participants altogether. There was one number in the one group and then a different number of people in the other group, because some people could make it to the one and some people couldn't make it to the other, but that was about how many we had. Regrettably, we only had male participants, which is kind of interesting. All of us are women, and we're teaching this to autistic men. I would love to have more women on the spectrum, obviously, as part of this in the future. Following the group, we conducted a feedback survey for all the participants to share their experience of the group and any feedback they had about the implementation, the content, the pacing, anything that they wanted to share with us. And we got some great feedback in that regard. That was an online survey. And then we had a few follow-up meetings for any interested participants, anyone who wanted to meet further with me and Erin. We would meet with them on Zoom to discuss any other additional issues that may have arisen during the groups. So in thinking about the future directions of the curriculum, I'm hopeful, again, we had time constraints. Grants have, unfortunately, only a certain period of time that you have to conduct them. And I would love to continue running the curriculum in groups with CSP students at Rutgers. I think that there's a great potential to see it continue on. Also, something that we had hoped to do that we didn't get to do by the end of the grant period was to publish the curriculum and disseminate it to professionals in the field and then hopefully the public. So that's something that I'd like to look at, is packaging it a bit more and making this something that can be consumed and used by the public. And then again, this is meant to be a foundation, right? That's the whole thing about this curriculum, is it's not meant to be like the encyclopedias in the old days that sit on the shelf collecting dust. We want this to be a living document that continues to be informed by the population that we're serving. So what the hope is to continue adding on to this over time and to continue to meet the needs of autistic individuals. So in thinking about all this and thinking about the work that we were able to do, and then thinking about what you hope to take home from here, what can you do to change this conversation, right? What can you do to improve discussions about autism and sexuality in the place where you work, in the place where you live, and with the people you support? So again, thinking about, how can professionals of any discipline, wherever you come from, improve these conversations? Well, again, something that, often I see come up, like I said before, about how professionals are often called in when something's already happened. We need to be proactive, right, instead of reactive. All too often we wait until something happens. We don't do that with anything else. We don't say, okay, I'm going to wait until Tommy gets hit by a car and then I'll teach him how to cross the street safely. No, you teach the kid how to cross the street before he gets hit by a car. But in this area, we wait until somebody's been traumatized in some way. We wait until someone has, been perhaps, assaulted or harmed in some way. And And of course, very often people on the spectrum are overwhelmingly the victims of sexual abuse, but also autistic people can be perpetrators of sexual abuse, unwittingly, frequently. Many people on the spectrum end up in the criminal justice system as a result, labeled as sex offenders as a result, perhaps when no offense was certainly intended. And the law doesn't make a distinction. The law doesn't care if you're autistic. You break the law, you go to jail, and that's it. And so, there's no reason that we should be waiting until someone ends up hurt either physically or emotionally. So if we're more proactive, if we take the initiative and say we need to talk about these things now before something happens, that I think will improve the outcomes for the individuals we support dramatically. As well as reframing ideas about sexuality. Right? Again, when we talk about sexuality from a behavior analytic perspective, we think about behaviors and behaviors to decrease or increase, but we forget that sexuality is also a facet of human expression, right? It's a part of who someone is. There's a person attached to those behaviors. So then the better question could be, okay, why is this person expressing themselves in this way? And what can we do so that this person can express their sexuality in a way that is safe and doesn't cause harm to themselves or to anyone else, right? Rather than trying to stamp out sexuality entirely, which is not the way we want to go. And again, it sounds really basic, but listen to autistic people, right? There are so many incredible autistic advocates out there telling their stories online, in different social media fora, in blogs. People are talking about the experiences that they've had, and you probably have amazing autistic adults in your community. We had some up here this morning who shared their incredible stories, who are fantastic resources to talk to, who can provide insights into the students you work with that no other professionals can. Even though I love my professionals, don't get me wrong. But this is an invaluable resource that is right there in your community. And of course, if you are going to engage with, autistic individuals, be mindful of the fact that there's a lot of emotional labor that is undertaken in talking about these things. It's not always easy to be sharing our traumas freely and with you, as I did today. So make sure that you compensate people fairly for their time and emotional labor as well, and their expertise. And then finally, funding that research. Like I was saying, we need more qualitative and quantitative research into sexuality. It's very difficult to get this funding still, unfortunately. It shouldn't be, but it still is. And so a couple strategies for, I have a few for parents and professionals, and then we'll go into, separate one for each. Creating boundaries, right? This is something that people ask me, when can you start? And I always say earlier than you think. Because when we talk about sex and sexuality, and we're talking about children, we're talking about things like bodily autonomy. We're talking about who can touch you, who can't touch you, right? All too often, we take a kid to grandma's house to say, okay, give grandma a kiss. I don't want to kiss grandma. Too bad you have to kiss grandma. And what that tells somebody, even from a young age, is that their boundaries don't matter, and that their body doesn't belong to them. Right? It may seem like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but it's really not. Because then when you get to the future and you have situations with relationships, somebody will think, well, I don't really want to have sex with this guy, but it doesn't matter what I want. I'll just go ahead and have sex with him anyway, even though I really don't want to. It allows someone to feel that their needs are unimportant, right? It teaches autistic people to prioritize the needs and comfort of others ahead of ourselves from a young age. So those boundaries matter, and they have to be established much, much earlier. Again, as I mentioned before, consent, that's a huge piece of all this, and teaching and consent, how to give and receive consent, how consent might look from a non-speaking perspective as well. As I said before about no being a complete sentence, right? That's a social and a safety skill. We're not great at respecting the no of autistic people. And I know we all have to do things in life that we don't want to do. We have to pay taxes, for example. We have to go to work when it's raining. We don't want to do those things. But all too often, that no isn't acknowledged for people on the spectrum. And it makes a person feel that their no doesn't matter, right? And it has to matter. It has to be heard. It has to be respected. And as I said before earlier, again, is always, always better. Always be thinking 5-10 years ahead. What does someone need to, if they're 5, what do they need to know when they're 15, Because what's cute when someone's 5 is less cute when somebody's 15, and we'll get them thrown in jail when they're 25, right? So we always have to be thinking about that. A few strategies for professionals. Again, it sounds really basic, but we have to acknowledge those sexual needs and desires of people on the spectrum. We're still not great at doing that, right? We get so squicked out. If people remember the word squick, I remember that word, when it comes to talking about sex and disability, right? But disabled and autistic people are sexual beings. We have those needs. They don't go away just because we're autistic or have autism. And if people were already acknowledging those needs, I wouldn't need to say it, but that's where we still are. And within that framework, think about what is it this person wants, right? What is it they're interested in? What is their goal? Could it be that they want a girlfriend? Do they want a friend? Do they want to have somebody to go to the movies with? Do they, what is it that is their goal here? And what is the best way to help them achieve that goal, right? That's something that I think, is a good way to get started in these conversations and get started in thinking about all this. And again, as I said before, knowing what you don't know, right? It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to not know what the right thing is in a given moment. But then the question is knowing where you can turn to for that information, knowing the resources you have at your disposal, the other professionals that you work with, just being aware of that, right? And then for parents, again, discussing issues at an age and maturity appropriate level, right? People often ask me, what's the right age to begin talking about sexuality? I always say, we have to look at the intersection of what someone should know for their chronological age and what they're interested in knowing at that particular point in their development, right? So what that means is you don't have to break out all the charts and slides and diagrams all at once. You can take something really small and turn it into a much larger conversation. You could say, hey, did you see those two characters kiss the other day? And that's a really small thing that can lead to a much, much bigger conversation. And being a safe space for your child, right? What's that mean? It means maybe your kid doesn't want to talk to you about these things, which is cold normal, because I don't know most 15-year-olds who would want to talk to their mother about sex. But if you let them know that you're there, they will know that, and they'll feel safe coming to you with things. If you even say, hey, okay, if you don't want to talk about this right now, that's fine. If you want a second opinion, I'll be here. That will let your child know that you're a safe person to talk to about these things, and that safety is paramount, especially in the teenage years when the whole world can often feel unsafe at every turn. And perhaps something else, that can be helpful is focusing on the future, right? We tend to get so caught up in the day-to-day and making sure that we get an autistic child just through that day that we often don't think about the future. But the future is where we're going to spend the rest of our lives, right? We're not going to be kids forever. We're going to become autistic adults. And so if we think about what is going to make my child happy when they grow up, that's something that helps us think more long-term and think about not just the moment, but the future to come. So a couple of resources. I mentioned before there are a few other sex ed curricula out there. Elevatus Training from Catherine McLaughlin is one of them. She is physically disabled. She uses a wheelchair, so it's a little bit more geared to physical disabilities, but there's plenty that covers developmental disabilities as well. And the Hearts curriculum out of Boston University, this is the one that I was talking about before that focuses on relationships and forming healthy relationships for people on the spectrum, which I think makes it complement very nicely to my ASK curriculum, our ASK curriculum. There's also the Sex Ed Guide for Self-Advocates, which is from the Organization for Autism Research. This is free and available online. It's for individuals on the spectrum ages 15 and up. And it has sections on everything from personal safety to dating to sexual orientation, the hygiene, abuse, all of that is covered there. And myself and Dr. Gerhardt recorded the introductions to each section. So we are on there as well. And Sexuality and Disability, a guide for parents. This is from Alberta Health Services in Canada. It's sex positive, it's LGBTQ inclusive, and I find that it's a really great starting point. It's not autism specific necessarily, but I think it's great, a great resource for parents and professionals alike in starting a conversation about sexuality. So these are a couple books that are presently out there. Hopefully my book will be among this array very soon. Asperger's Syndrome and Sexuality from Dr. Isabel Hanote. Making Sense of Sex, Sexuality and Relationship Education from Davida Hartman, and of course, Gender Identity, Sexuality and Autism. This is a collection of essays written by people on the spectrum. And as I've said, I encourage you where possible to read things that are written by people on the spectrum. You'll learn so much from reading those firsthand perspectives. It will be invaluable to you. And there are actually now some dating sites for autistic adults, not just dating, but friendships. Aspie Singles, Hickey, Autism Date, and Unipi. These are all dating sites that are out there. Obviously, I encourage you to do research on each of them before using any of them. eHarmony also has a great section about online dating safety tips, which I think can be modified really spectacularly for people on the spectrum. So again, I'm a little gun shy with online dating, given my own experiences, but I think this is something that could be really helpful for people. And as a final thought, to remember that you can't stop life from happening, right? If you put somebody in a bubble so that nothing will ever happen to them, then nothing will ever happen to them. But that's not how you ensure that we as people on the spectrum will be able to make the same choices as our neurotypical peers and will be able to thrive and succeed when you're no longer here. And I love this quote from Frida Kahlo, al final del día podemos soportarnos de lo que creemos, which means at the end of the day, we endure far more than we think we can. And for me, I find this applies to autistic individuals. We are resilient because we often have to be, because we're trying to succeed and exist in a world that's not built for people like us. But you will not harm our innocence by teaching us about sexuality. You will not damage us. You will, in fact, be empowering us to see ourselves as fully realized sexual beings and to make those choices safely that we need to make when you're no longer here. So I thank you all so much for your time and attention. Here's my contact information. If you scan that, it'll take you to follow my social media pages. And thank you so much. And we'll go to questions. Are there any questions from anyone in the room before we go to the Slido? Any hands? I have no filter that I'm aware of, so you can ask anything. It doesn't bother me. Oh. Okay, well, we have one here. Should students who are autistic have a separate sex education class different from the general education setting? That's an interesting one. That's come up before. And I think that there's so much, again, if we had comprehensive and inclusive sex education that included the life skills piece, I think everyone would benefit from that. I think when you segregate autistic people from neurotypicals in that it says that there's something somehow inherently different about autistic people, it kind of creates this othering sense, I think we all would benefit from learning from each other in many ways. I mean, I think there are some things that maybe some autistic people would feel more comfortable asking, not in front of their other peers, in which case you could offer to have one-on-one meetings with a student, or things that you can address if they're not comfortable asking those again in front of peers. But I had health class with my neurotypical peers. I was mainstreamed all through school. There was no self-contained classroom back then. So I think it also lets everyone know that everybody struggles with this stuff, right? Also, when you separate people, it's this thing of the neurotypical kids, they know all this. You're the ones who are broken and different. But the fact is, we all struggle with this stuff. If we let people know that nobody has it all figured out, I think we'd all be better off too. Instead of just feeling like we're the only one who screwed up, we're the only one who doesn't know what we're doing. So, it is situational. I'd say it depends, of course, on the school setting and on the circumstances, but I would prefer a fully inclusive class myself. We have some other questions here. Let's see. Do you suggest talking about sex with our autistic students when traditional sex ed is introduced in the curriculum? I think yes, because I think there's going to be questions that will come up that probably won't be addressed in the traditional curriculum. A lot of curriculum, first of all, are not comprehensive. And there's only a handful of states in which the curriculum are even required to be medically accurate, which I learned from Dr. Gerhardt. So, there's things that are probably not necessarily going to be covered, and the things I had questions about, I know when I was a teenager, were not covered in a general health class. How do you know if someone likes you? How do you ask someone out on a date? How do you go out on a date? All those things were all missing, and then those social pieces, right? So I think you can have kind of a complementary sex education alongside whatever's being taught in the general sex ed class. Look at where the gaps are, right? Look at what might not be touched on there, because a lot of times the general sex ed class just covers anatomy, right? Biology, pregnancy, STIs, things like that, but all those other pieces are often missing. So I think both is great, and thank you for that question. I see you guys asking about the curriculum. It's not, again, we're still looking to package it. It's not available fully as of yet. If you email me, I may be able to send it to you. I need to just double check with my collaborators to make sure that is all set and good. Regarding about the use of the curriculum with individuals with higher support needs, just as a note, I prefer to use higher support needs versus minimal support needs rather than high functioning and low functioning. I find that those labels can be a bit stigmatizing, and often high functioning ignores and dismisses the things that people have challenges with, and low functioning dismisses and ignores the things that people have the abilities people have. But so yes, for individuals who have higher support needs, that's not who the audience for this curriculum is at this moment, but that is certainly something that we have thought about looking at for the future, potentially modifying the curriculum in that vein. There are, however, other curricula and teaching materials that exist for individuals with higher support needs. My colleague, Dr. Bobby Gallagher, who is amazing, she has 2 adult children on the spectrum who are high support needs, and she does sex education for this population, so she's a tremendous resource in that vein. Let's see, we have, how do we know if the person has cognitive function to give consent, right? Well, again, consent, to my mind, isn't just a matter of cognitive functioning. I know that is a piece of it, but consent kind of comes down to like giving somebody a choice, right? It's yes or no. And if we can conduct preference assessments, right? If we can ask somebody, do you want M&Ms or do you want Skittles? We can ask someone, do you want to kiss or do you not want to kiss someone? Like it's kind of the next step up, I feel, on the ladder. It's, the educational piece that's often missing. Like sometimes we don't know what someone's background is, if they might understand, for example, what does it mean to do these particular sexual acts, or what does it mean to kiss someone as a French kiss? What does that entail? Right? That's a whole other separate piece. But I think consent is possible for everyone, or assent, as we would say. Assent is also often used with people who are non-speaking or people who may have intellectual disabilities. There are ways of obtaining that with people from those populations. That are not just verbal means of consent, right? So that's starting to happen a lot more now. We're seeing that a lot in the research literature. And I think it's so important. It's absolutely vital. And thank you for asking that question. I don't know if we have any other. I teach a health and safety class for our middle school instructional program. What curriculum or topics would you recommend regarding puberty, sex ed, relationships? In terms of topics, for middle school, forgive my bluntness, but the biggest one would be how not to be an asshole, because middle school kids are rotten. It's just all the hormones are surging like crazy, and everybody is just, that's when the cliques really start to harden and form, and people really, it becomes a totally different thing in middle school. So I'd say just like letting people be like making sure kids are aware of the importance of empathy, compassion, being kind to others, knowing that other people are struggling just as much with stuff, that nobody has it all together, right? If we take away this idea that everybody's supposed to have it all together by a certain age, especially, that's what people think. Oh, I have to know all this by the time I'm 17. I have to know where I'm going to college, what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, who I'm going to marry. No. Like there's people in their 40s and 50s and 60s who don't know what they want to be when they grow up. You don't have to know all that in middle school, and you don't have to hold it and feel insecure among other people, for making them feel like they don't know, right? So just like, again, it sounds like, but teaching middle school kids how to be human, basically, because kids tend to kind of forget it sometimes at that age. It's so they become little gremlins for some reason. I don't know why. Someone threw water on them after midnight, I guess. But anyway, that would be something, yeah. But of course, and then all the other pieces, definitely, sexting is a huge one. Digital communications, those are huge things. The difference between deepfake porns and reality, because that's a huge problem right now, deepfake stuff. There's just so much. There's like a million things, but thank you for that question, and I'm out of time, so thank you all so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Was there more questions that you didn't get to? I was just asking if there's more questions she didn't get to, because we could get answers from her to the questions, and then we can email them out.
there was
So
one
we'll
more
get some
that just came in.
responses from you, and
Yeah.
then I can email them out to everybody. Sex ed, important. We go out into schools and we do program evaluations. And one of the big things that we ask is, how do you teach puberty? How do you teach navigating social relationships? And more often than not, guess what? There's not a whole lot of information there. So we know it is a huge issue. It's been an issue. Many of the individuals that I've worked with when I started in grad school, just a few years ago, 20 years ago, now, they've gone through puberty, and there was nothing available. And so we had the luxury of creating visuals for individuals with autism, because we know visuals are effective and they work. And so we have penises that we have put developmentally growth cycles to, as well as breasts. And so it's always questioned, what's ISD tech going to do if they see my computer, as to why I have some of these interesting visuals on there. But a need, a growing need, and hopefully we can do better at preparing our students with disabilities to better understand their bodies as they are growing and changing, and as well as navigating social relationships. Amy, thank you. As I said, wonderful information. Very much appreciated. So thank you. And if there are any additional questions that came through, we will get her responses to send out.